Hello and welcome to Palava, a podcast series and discussion forum where we discuss simple yet profound questions that drive our thinking across the continent. As we know, the simplest questions sometimes cut the deepest. In this first series, we are still exploring and fleshing out the simple question that I was asked, which is, what are we Africans about? Join me today as we continue on this quest. Today, I'll share a story around a question that I was asked in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, quite early in my career. My first expatriate job was regional market support manager for Latin America at the great company called Unilever. To this day, I maintain that, as far as I'm concerned, Unilever was the greatest company in the world, and that's because I owe my real life education to this great company. The corporate nerve center of Unilever was Unilever House in London. This was an HQ that was managing a network of over 500 subsidiaries in about 75 countries in every region of the world. So, as you can imagine, it was a place of mythical reputation for people such as myself who had joined in one of the outposts, as it were. And as befitting a well established global company of those days, Unilever had a complex organization structure. But I only mention this in passing today because I had the great fortune to experience this company at a local operating company level, which is where I joined once I graduated. I then moved on to a regional post, which I will discuss an anecdote of. And then ultimately, I had the opportunity to work at a global strategic level. Now, this made me understand quite early in my career how things get done across large swathes of geography covering uh, consumers of different social and economic and cultural groups of people across the world. Now, at East Africa Industries in Nairobi, we used to prepare weeks in advance for visitors from Unilever House who were coming to poke around what we were doing locally and see if we were aligned with the global strategy. And the not so original joke that was told those days, I believe, having met a lot of people from various parts of Unilever over the decades, is that this joke must have traveled from country to country. But the joke was that people who flew in from the center of Unilever, which the HQ, were called seagulls because they flew in, they made a lot of noise, they deposited their droppings on our heads, and they flew out again. But in those days, little did I know that I would become one of them and therefore see both sides of the coin. I arrived at Unilever House to take up my expatriate post. And for those who know London, I would come out of the tube station at Blackfriars on the Circle Line. And once you emerge from the underground, you are confronted by an awe-inspiring, bold, colossal building. And right from the word go, it always left one more and more respectful. So as you're approaching Unilever House, it's as if you're approaching a sacred temple or one of these grand cathedrals, basically a holy place. And I noticed I was not the only one because it just had this effect that whether you're visitors or employees alike, we were tiptoeing in a hush as you approach this convex facade of Unilever House. And then as you enter the entrance hall, it is really huge, cavernous with high ceilings It's almost like you just fall silent naturally, like you're in one of these museums where you're not allowed to talk, or you believe that speaking is kind of out of place. Unilever House is on the Victoria embankment of the Thames River, and it overlooks Blackfriars Bridge. And I go into its architecture because this was a potent symbol of British industrial might, especially emanating from the Empire days. And if we were to get a bit poetic, we would say that because of its architecture, this iron fist that it had over many subsidiaries across the world was couched in a velvet glove. So, because it's elegant, it's classical Art Deco type architecture with pillars and columns out there. And then when you go into its interior, this artistic sort of theme is maintained because in those days, I haven't been back lately, but we had huge works of art that adorned the walls throughout Unilever House, and these were painted by the original paintings by classical authors, so they must have been significant artistic works. So, to this day, you can still detect that Unilever House. It left a powerful impression on me right from the first day I stepped there. And this effect never wore off because I had this same feeling of reverence every morning when I got off at Blackfriars Circle Line underground station and I approached Unilever House. But as I say, I was not the only one because my colleagues kind of behaved in the same way. It's fair to say that this edifice, it kind of evoked mixed feelings because my English colleagues who were worldly and, had this dry humor that I got used to, but they wryly referred to the building, Unilever House, as the chapel of rest. Um, but, I think this was an affectionate thing. I myself, coming from one of these outposts, Commonwealth sort of outposts, as it were, I absolutely loved the place. I arrived as an energetic, eager, young expatriate willing to do whatever early in my career. Actually, as I said, my thing was I was just eager to learn as much as possible. So I read voraciously. I did whatever I could. And because I was unexpectedly given this position that covered Latin America, I immediately immersed myself into learning Spanish over my first 3 months. I attended evening classes at a place called City Lit, uh, which was in Covent Garden. I believe it still exists. And then I was also making use of the excellent Unilever House library, which was equipped with what at that time was really cutting edge technology in the form of CD-ROMs, for those who remember them, CD-ROM language programs, as well as a variety of books that kind of taught grammar and vocabulary. But I picked up Spanish, and I had the time because while I was making my transition from having an operating job where you have daily targets, if not weekly, my job really consisted of attending meetings, maybe an average of one a day. And I had plenty of time to disappear down into the library at the basement and polish up my Spanish. Okay, so to move on swiftly, one of the biggest shocks I got when I now hit the road eventually and started visiting the vibrant cities of Latin America, like, say, Rio de Janeiro, Fortaleza in Brazil, and Bogota in Colombia, and places like those, which for us coming from Africa so far away that you just see whatever's out there in the mass media, and usually it's something that's quite colorful, especially activities like carnival or football or whatever cultural activity. So I was really delighted to have a first-hand experience of some of these countries. But as I say, I was shocked, to put it mildly, to find that some of these cities, it seemed to me that the majority of people I met out in the streets were people of African descent. They were dark skinned people in the streets. And this took me by surprise because the representatives of these countries were invariably people of European descent. Even the ones we met in the offices were like that. If you include people of mixed heritage, then they certainly were in the majority in many of these cities that I visited. I had learned to my considerable puzzlement that in Europe or the UK, where I lived, was that uh, these people of mixed heritage were considered to be people of African ancestry. There was no quota given to the European side of their parentage. So that was also a big reason for surprise. Okay, now we all know that back home in Africa, in contrast, people of mixed ancestry, we consider them to be Muzungus if they only speak English or only speak French. And which is not a negative by any means, because being a Mzungu is still considered as very prestigious due to this colonial overhang we still have. So I would even argue, and we can argue this going forward, that this remains the case. So, but when I arrived in London, I found that these guys who here in Africa we would say, oh, well, they're more European than anything. There, they were lumped together under the classification of black. It didn't matter how polished their English was. It didn't matter how posh the schools they went to. And this kind of bewildered me in those early days. If you're listening to me a bit carefully, you might notice that I'm avoiding using the word race. And why is that? It's deliberate. And I do not use the word race because it's not an African construct. I speak a few African languages. There's no word for race. And the second reason I don't use this word, and I'm just explaining so that as we go forward, if you see me gingerly stepping around this word and using words like heritage, ancestry, whatever, is that a word like race, when we are speaking English, does not come neutral. It is preloaded with a lot of European connotation, a worldview, where a framework has been created that delineates, kind of a sharp boundary of classifications. And implicit to this is that there's an hierarchy in terms of this race thing. So as we go forward with these discussions of ours under Afrika Palava, Afrika Baraza, Afrika Mbongi, we are going to avoid this stuff because these are things that just cloud the issue. And anyway, we are discussing our issues as Africans across the whole continent. Yet it's going to be a challenge because I'm sure once we have guests here, some of these things will creep in. But we will try very much as these concepts are ingrained in many of us who've undergone European education, let alone the Europeans themselves, we need to debunk some of these underlying pseudoscientific things that used to just come naturally to these guys, where you had studies that were supposed to kind of prove from a scientific point of view that there were real fundamental differences between people of different heritage, basically those coming from Europe and those coming from Africa. So this is a toxic word. We will avoid it. We will have to come up with a word that we prefer to use instead of that. And I'm sure we have quite a few in our deep well of African language resources. Okay, so as I say, I found much to my surprise that I could blend in the streets of some of these Latin American cities quite comfortably because I looked like quite a few people there, or they looked like me. And as someone who was still curious and didn't have too, many preconceptions, I started to form this general picture in my mind that Latin American societies had large populations of African descendants. Then I landed in Argentina for my first time. And in Argentina, I went in advance of my boss because we were coordinating a biennial regional marketing directors conference. And that year it was held in the coastal resort city of Mar del Plata. Okay, my duties then, as I say, really consisted of making sure our presentations from the center were well constructed. We had rehearsed with my boss. In those days, we did not project directly from the computers, as you remember. We had to print our presentations on acetates, and then we placed them on overhead projectors. And as the support guy, kind of supporting the regional kind of vice president who I was reporting to, it was my job to make sure this thing flowed smoothly. Yeah, this was the era before PowerPoint, and I remember it with a lot of nostalgia and fondness. But after finishing this conference, I left for the weekend, and I went to Buenos Aires to look around. I moved from Mar del Plata on the coast, and I went to Buenos Aires, the capital. And I checked into a hotel in an area called Palermo, in the center of Buenos Aires, because I'd been advised that it was easy to walk around and get a feel for the heartbeat of the city. Kind of walk to a few nearby attractions. In addition to the place having a wealth of restaurants and cafes, green spaces, clubs, that sort of thing. And I enjoyed walking in those days. I still do. So I typically liked a base quite central from where I could walk. Um, After breakfast on the Saturday morning, I stepped out of the hotel and into the adjacent street, which I discovered was called Avenida del Libertador. In those days, you memorize these things or you referred to them, and therefore it stuck in your memory because we didn't have Google Maps. So we didn't have the luxury of kind of delegating finding your way in a new city to artificial intelligence, let's put it that way. You actually had to rely on your own natural intelligence in the form of map reading. So you take a map at the hotel and you figure out where you want to go and the name of the street, and you look for the street sign, and you find your way that way. The other way of navigating was, of course, when you're lost, then it forces you to interact with the local guys there that you find on the pavement, or if you step into a shop or whatever. And you say good morning or good afternoon, and you ask for directions, which invariably I found that local people, were always more than happy to give to visitors. Okay, so here I was after breakfast on the Avenida del Libertador. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, especially since I last spoke Spanish, I think, decades ago. But as I went into this really broad avenue, I found myself immediately sucked into kind of a vortex of a pulsating crowd of clearly excited people. This was not a strange feeling for me because it was the feeling I experienced back home in Nairobi during my high school days, when a few of us would sneak out of school, make our way to town on the bus, and then get off at the terminus, which those days was called the Tusker bus station in central Nairobi. And then from there, we would walk towards the city stadium to watch a team called Gor Mahia, which was what we supported in those days. And we would walk down from Tusker, eventually joining a thoroughfare called Jogo Road. And before we went to some of the let me call them shacks in reality, in an area called Burma, where we would kind of strengthen ourselves with porridge made from millet and mandazis for those who speak Kiswahili. So this would give us the ballast to then walk into the stadium and be on our feet cheering the whole afternoon. But the thing that I found familiar with this scenario I found myself in Buenos Aires was that once you joined Jogo Road, you had no choice. You just surf the wave of people because you just a whole crowd, everybody kind of excited but headed in the same direction, and you do then just move along. You're carried along and you're swept along with these guys. So that was the scenario. Okay, even if I kept an open mind, honestly, these crowds in Buenos Aires exceeded anything I could reasonably have imagined. I drifted with them, as I say, in whichever direction they were going. I put my map in my back pocket, and I found myself on the sidewalk of a very impressive wide avenue that it seemed to be close to traffic. And then along this avenue, there was just music and pageantry and military bands marching in ceremonial uniform, including, squadrons of women marching up and down. It was a really great sight. And since I wasn't aware that there was going to be anything significant going on, it's just my first time. I just happened to find these things going on. And, you kind of get the impression, wow, is this how this city is? Now, the remarkable thing was how friendly everyone was. You know, everywhere I went, people kept saying "Hola, Buenos Dias," all that stuff to me. But the Spanish they spoke there was really fast. It was too fast for me. It was not the textbook things I had been learning, or things that allowed me to follow proceedings in a boardroom. I couldn't keep up conversation. So after a bit of greetings and all that stuff, guys just moved on. But they moved on smiling, and then the next guy would come and say hello and all that stuff, and it was fantastic. And then as I stood there watching these processions, a couple approached me, man and his wife, and they had a camera slung around the guy's neck. And then, as with everybody, we exchanged greetings. Then our conversation came to a bit of an abrupt end because of my limited vocabulary. But the husband then gestured to me, kind of like he wanted me to take a photograph of them. And of course, I agreed. Hand over the camera. I'm quite happy to operate the device. So I reached out my hand for this camera, but I came away empty-handed because after I'd agreed, he promptly handed the camera to his wife. And then he came and stood next to me, and he, put his arm around me, he embraced me, and smiling into the shot. And after his wife had taken these pictures, then they exchanged positions, and she came and stood with me, and we took a couple of photos as well. And then they said, muchas gracias, and thank you very much. And then, because we had a bit of rapport, I established with my kind of hesitant Spanish, and with a lot of extravagant gesticulation and hand movements and all that stuff. But I established that these guys had not come from Buenos Aires. They'd come from a city called Santa Fe, which I later heard was like over 400 kilometers away from Buenos Aires. But they had come for this fete that was going on in the city. And then, as this couple melted away into the rest of the crowd, it dawned on me that the reason they had taken a picture was not because they recognized me from anywhere. It was just because, as far as my eye could see, I was the only black person in that city. I was the only guy, as far as I could see, among all these thousands of people, that was someone of African descent. So no wonder I stood out like a totem, and everybody was saying hi. So far from being the tourist, I was actually a bit of a tourist attraction myself, including people from Santa Fe. Okay, I took all this in quite positively because I was enjoying the spectacle of these endless processions. But eventually, one of these friendly guys approached me and he said hello like many others. But this time, the difference was when we got stuck with the Spanish, we found that the guy spoke perfect English. He switched to English and he spoke fluently. So at last, I could have a real conversation with the local person. I was quite excited because, of course, having just watched naively what was going on, I had questions in my mind. But they were not so burning that I did not need to see the city at first hand and mingle a bit more. But um, once we got our greetings and our warm up out of the way, I found that he had a question of his own. And this is the simple question which I believe Africans or people of African descent might find a bit familiar. It's a simple question, but it's multi layered, so it depends how deep you want to take it. The question he asked me was, So where are you from? Uh, so as I was thinking now, do I tell him I'm from Muhoroni? Do I say I'm from Nairobi? Do I say I'm from Kenya? Do I say I'm from Africa? Or do I say I've just come from London where I work? Anyway, um, he asks, "Are you American?" You must be American. I say, "No, no, no. I'm from Kenya." Well, you can appreciate that in Buenos Aires, Kenya does not feature prominently in anybody's conversation. So he asks, "Where is that again? Where is that?" So I had to expand the thing a bit, and I said, "It's Africa." And then he says, "Wow, this is fantastic. You've come all the way from Africa to Argentina. That's amazing." The guy was very warm. He was as friendly as everyone I'd met in Buenos Aires. And so I expanded. I told him, well, I work in London. I'd come for a conference. I'd been in Mar del Plata. And now I had decided to spend my spare time visiting Buenos Aires. It was my first time. I just wanted to walk around and get a feel for this city. And this excited him a great deal because he says, "You know what? You are the first person I have met that comes from what I call the real Africa. In this country that I've grown up in, this is the first time I've met somebody who's come all the way from Africa to our country. So, welcome to Buenos Aires, welcome to Argentina. And more than that, because of this, you're my special guest today. So, I will show you around the city so that you get an overview, get a good flavor for what Buenos Aires is about." You can appreciate that this was a total stranger I had met in the streets of a large city that I was visiting for the first time. So before I threw myself into his custody, as it were, I decided to test him out with one of these tasteless jokes, or their borderline, which is, I asked him, "How can I be so sure that you're not intending to mug me, to take me down a dark, narrow alleyway and mug me of my slim wallet?" And I told him, "I must warn you that I will mug you first because I'm a tough guy from Africa." And of course, he burst out laughing, and I laughed, and he found the borderline joke utterly funny. And then he repeated his offer. He says, "I'm offering you the freedom of the city of Buenos Aires." So we relaxed, and I said, "Okay, fine. Let's get on with it." And he says, "The first thing we have to do is we have to energize ourselves with a meal. So I'm going to take you to eat a proper Argentinian steak." He tells me, "This is an experience, I have to tell you. So vamos, let's go." So we walked, from my recollection, 10 minutes or so, and we went into a cool restaurant. And then from the interactions this guy had with the maitre d', I could see that the gentleman was a regular customer of this fine restaurant. And eventually, a waiter arrived with the most impressive slab of steak I had ever seen on my plate. It was very thick, maybe 2.5 inches or something like that. Really, I'd never seen a single cut of steak that was this size. And he told me this thing is called Lomo, very famous uh, Argentinian steak. He says, "Enjoy." Okay. So we dug into this beef, and I must say it was very nice and very tasty. I couldn't quite determine which part of the ox it came from, but just for future reference. But it was absolutely delicious, I must say. And then when we finished, the moment of truth came. I took out my wallet to pay the bill. And then we proceeded to have a vigorous argument, as one would have, because he was having none of it. He refused. He insisted on paying the bill. I, in turn, dug my heels in. I refused. I said, look, you've taken your time out to show me around, out of the kindness of your heart. So the least I can do is let me just pay this one. And he said no. I then said, okay, then let's split the bill. Let me pay half, that sort of thing. But finally, he killed off the argument by saying what we kind of say back home, which is, I'm your host. You're visiting my home city. You're coming all the way from Africa. Under no circumstances am I going to accept you to pay. So I conceded defeat. And I borrowed a line from Idi Amin, which was, I told him, I promise I'm going to revenge when you visit me in Nairobi or in my home village of Muhoroni, right? I'm not quoting Idi Amin because he's great in terms of values, but you remember he visited the Queen, and after someone who could be invited to visit the Queen for a banquet, it means in those days he was considered acceptable by the the British establishment at that time. I don't know if it was before he then became a dictator or someone that we do not like because of all this repressive stuff that he committed in Uganda. But we understand at the end of that meal, he told the Queen, thank you very much, I am fed up now. And when you come to Uganda, I will revenge. So that's what I was telling my host with a light touch. Okay, so we finished our meal and we rejoined the crowds in the streets. But they were going to a place where this holiday, this big fete, was going to be held, and it was going to a place called Campo Argentino, or something like that. Campo Argentino de Polo, a big field. And what my host told me was that I had actually stumbled on the National Independence Day of Argentina, which was being celebrated that weekend. And that's why things were happening like this. And all these processions were actually going to do the real thing at that Campo Argentino de Polo. But since I'd seen the gist of it, and the crowds were really going to be quite large, and you never know how far you're going to be from a thing, my host, we agreed, let's skip this thing, because there's a lot more to see in Buenos Aires than this procession. And we decided to spend the afternoon visiting main tourist sites that were within walking distance of that Palamo area, which indeed we found ourselves. So we passed through a couple of museums, and after about an hour and a half of walking comfortably, we arrived at a place called Recoleta. And in particular, we arrived at this place that is called Cementerio de la Recoleta. And I stood here dumbfounded because I was facing a very paradoxical sight. It was extravagantly beautiful, but it had a very melancholic edge. Why? Because the place is a graveyard. But it was a graveyard such as I have never seen before or since. in my life. So if you ever find yourself in Buenos Aires, I would suggest that you should go there and get a feel for what I experienced on that day. But really, to call it a cemetery does not do it any justice, because in reality, what I found was a densely populated city of the dead. These departed, they were not buried underground like we are used to, and then you have a headstone or beneath some tombstones. They were housed in magnificent buildings, really ornate and grandiose, but not because of the space, but just because of the architecture, because they were all, each of these kind of buildings were built in different flavors of classic European architecture. And then in between, you have these alleyways. So we weaved our way through these alleys, but on each flank, you have these miniature neo-Gothic cathedrals and Greek temples and Art Deco kind of buildings that are cuboids. And some of these mausoleums, really amazing. They were so tall, they were towering over us. They were made of marble and granite, and some of them had wrought iron kind of gates, and they were so tall that sunlight did not reach the maze of the cobbled alleyways that we are walking on, except in, like shafts of light that come through the cracks as the sun, kind of proceeds towards setting later in the afternoon. So, an amazing place. And some of these outlandish temples of the dead, as I would call them, were really wondrous sights. So, of course, we would stop and we would take it all in and all that. And eventually we found ourselves at a tomb of somebody I could recognize, because this was the tomb of Eva Perón. And it was a black polished tomb. And the style of this one was quite restrained compared to everything else around. But it was one of the very popular places of pilgrimage, judging from the bouquets and fresh flowers that were wilting on the right around this tomb site. So a really popular place that everybody who visited La Recoleta would say, hey, I better see the mausoleum of Eva Perón, who's a national hero of some sort in Argentina. Okay, anyway, my host explained to me, gave me some overview. He said that the rich families of Buenos Aires owned each of these edifices, these tombs, and their forebears kind of occupied the lower floors in the basement going downwards. And then the coffins and were they sarcophagi or sarcophaguses? I don't know what is the right plural of that word anymore, but the more recent arrivals would then be kind of found in different levels going upwards. And he said that this place had a population of maybe approaching 6,000 people. So a really amazing cemetery. It had a great effect on me. In summary, when we left, I was saying, wow, this is an amazing shrine of European ancestral worship, is what I could say. And then we made our way back to the hotel. The avenues and boulevards that we walked in um, were really elegantly European. They could have been transplanted straight from Paris. I mean, you've seen on TV or you walked the Champs Elysees and places like that. It was like that, even in style of buildings and everything, the cafes, everything. And as we walked back, we passed via the Eva Perón museum, but it was a bit of an anticlimax given how dramatic this uninhabited cemetery I had visited was. So my host and I, we exchanged telephone numbers. We didn't have mobiles in those days, really. No, actually, we had just started to have mobiles. I had a mobile. But we exchanged telephone numbers. We then email addresses as well. And we parted ways and we promised to keep in touch. We promised to meet again, whether in Buenos Aires, whether in London, or wherever he would visit. Especially, I extended an open invitation to him to let me know whenever he visited East Africa or Nairobi. And I would take him around just like he had done for me. And then the next day, I did things on my own. I found that there was such beautiful parks and flower gardens. There was an area called Bosque de Palamo, which is a fantastic place I would recommend for anybody visiting there. And within it, there's a very impressive Japanese garden, at least there was in those days. And then I flew back to London. And at the earliest opportunity at Unilever House, I went to the office of an expatriate colleague from Argentina. And I went to ask him a couple of questions that were kind of rattling about in my mind. I told him of my extraordinary visit, my fantastic experience. I marveled at how amazingly friendly and welcoming his countrymen were. I mean, I'd never been in a city and treated so well by everybody, strangers, and it was fantastic. So of course, Buenos Aires rose in the rankings of my list of favorite cities that I visited throughout, and it remains quite high in my list of places I would revisit at the drop of a hat. So my colleague, he smiled and he acknowledged that indeed he was not surprised that people are so friendly and had treated me so well out in the streets, and even this thing of somebody clearing out his whole day, his whole Saturday, and just taking the time to extend the hospitality of the city to me was not that strange to him. And so I go to the question, which is not really the thrust of this episode today. The thrust of this episode was the question he asked me, saying, "Where are you from?" And how, for us who travel crisscross the continent, it is a question, or the world, it's a question that you get asked. I've been asked the same question in China, I've been asked the same question in Russia, I've been asked the same question in Europe. I've been asked the same question in various parts of Africa as we travel around. And it's not a question that sometimes ends there, because as soon as you answer it, then sometimes there's a follow up, and some of the follow up is, okay, but where exactly is that? And when you mention that it is Africa, then of course people say, yes, yes, yes. I'm not going to trigger a palaver we are coming back to, or a topic we're coming back to, which is this very interesting topic that is popular at the moment, where guys are saying, Africa is not a country. You not aware that it is a continent. We'll come to that one, because my view is different from what the books and the the speeches that I have heard. But anyway, the question that I ended up asking him, which I couldn't understand, was why is Buenos Aires so different from cities in neighboring countries in Latin America? In other words, how come this is the most European city I'd been to? Um, Even in Europe, some of the cities I had visited, that was before I started going to Moscow and places like that. But you would find people of African descent. You just bump into them in the streets, not in Buenos Aires. And he explained to me, kind of matter of fact, that when slavery ended, the African descendants who were freed, the best job for them, which they were paid well for, was to join the army in Argentina. And they were put at the front line when the battles that they were fighting were against the indigenous people in the interior. And the result was that these two populations virtually wiped each other out. And the rest of the African guys traveled across the borders, went to Brazil or went to Colombia, wherever, because this was not really a sustainable state of affairs. So the society got reconstructed as a European society. And then after that, there were successive waves of European immigrants that came in, especially those who found themselves on the losing side of what the Europeans call world wars. World War One, a wave of guys arrived. World War Two, another big wave of people arrived, and so on and so forth, which meant that even the original Spanish, colonialists kind of got watered down because you had waves of Germans, Italians, and other Europeans joining in. So that was the background he gave me. But what I have to tell you is Buenos Aires is an amazing city. I was treated so well. And I was asked this question that I have always been asked. And it's a question that we will keep asking ourselves. But ultimately, I answer that we are all Africans. And our identity is African. And my experience is that some of these boundaries that we put a lot of meaning behind are utterly artificial. And if they're real to us, when we step out of the continent, there are people who have a bit more of an objective lens and they kind of reinforce this thing that ultimately you might look at yourself and compartmentalize ourselves into various small communities. But to them, we are Africans. And on that note, we come to the end of today's Palaver episode. I ask you to join the conversation, join the Palaver. You can follow the channel. Please think through the question of the day, which is where are you from? And if you've got any thoughts around this, then please comment freely down the line and look out for future opportunities where we will be discussing this thing either live or using digital means so that we coalesce around some of these simple yet deep questions that we are asking ourselves as a Pan-African community. Thank you for listening and look out for the next episode.